An ancient text claims the first Pharaoh earned his title by creating a tax on the dead. We delve into the bizarre story of Rikayon, who went from a wise foreigner to the usurper of Egypt's throne. For thousands of years, the pharaohs of Egypt ruled as something more than kings. They were living gods. They built monuments that scraped the heavens and were buried with treasures meant for an eternity. Their power was absolute, their names synonymous with divine might. Names like Tutankhamun, Ramesses, Cleopatra. They bring to mind golden masks, sprawling empires, and a civilization that seemed to touch the very edge of the divine. We think we know their story. We think their power flowed from the gods, from the sun, from the sacred waters of the Nile. But a strange, ancient text tells a very different story.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
It's a story that's been hiding in plain sight, tucked away in a book most people have never even heard of. It claims the very first pharaoh wasn't a god. He wasn't even Egyptian. He was a foreigner, a poor, desperate man who seized Egypt's throne by creating the most bizarre, the most macabre, the most audacious tax in the history of the world. A tax on the dead. This is the story of how the most powerful title in the ancient world was born not from divine right, but from a scheme so cunning it held the very afterlife for ransom. This is the story of Rikayon, the king who taxed the dead. The world of ancient Egypt and the enigmatic king. To really get how unbelievably audacious this plan was, you first have to understand the mind of an ancient Egyptian. For them, life on earth was just a dress rehearsal. The real show was the afterlife. Their entire existence revolved around preparing for the journey to the field of reeds, their version of paradise. This wasn't just a casual belief. It was the central organizing principle of their society. From the grandest pyramid to the humblest grave, every burial was a sacred promise that death was not the end. The rituals, the mummification, the prayers, they were all non-negotiable steps for a soul's safe passage. To mess with this process, to deny someone their proper burial, was to condemn their soul to an eternity of wandering. A fate literally worse than death. It was unthinkable, a violation of the most sacred laws of gods and men. This was the Egypt that existed under a king named Osiris. Now, this isn't the god Osiris, the green-skinned lord of the underworld, though the name is tantalizingly similar. According to the text that tells this story, the Book of Jasher, King Osiris was a mortal ruler, the son of a man named Anum. But he was a king with a very peculiar habit. He was a recluse. Osiris believed it was beneath a king to be seen by his subjects. So, he instituted a bizarre custom. He would only appear in public one single day out of the entire year. On this day, and this day only, the palace gates would open, and he would sit in judgment, listen to petitions, and dispense justice. For the other 364 days, he was a ghost, a rumor, a power felt but never seen. It was a system that created an enormous power vacuum. A kingdom needs more than a once-a-year judge. It needs daily administration. It needs someone to manage disputes, commerce, and the endless machinery of a state. And into this strange, semi-absent kingdom, a man arrived. A man with nothing to his name but a sharp mind and a hunger that would change Egypt forever. The arrival of a cunning stranger. His name was Rikayon. The Book of Jasher describes him as a man from the land of Shinar, a region in Mesopotamia or modern-day Iraq. He was, by all accounts, brilliant. The text calls him wise and full of understanding. But he was also flat broke. He was an outsider with no connections, no family, and no money. Driven by a need to save himself from starvation, he decided to head to Egypt, the legendary land of wealth, hoping to win the king's favor and land a job. But when Rikayon arrived, he hit a brick wall. He asked how he could see the king, only to be told the strange truth. King Osiris was visible just one day a year. He'd traveled all this way only to find the door to opportunity locked for what might as well be an eternity. Starving and dejected, Rikayon found shelter in the ruins of an old bakery. He tried to make a living, scrounging up some vegetables to sell at the market, but the locals just ridiculed him. They saw a foreign vagrant, and the city rabble stole his goods, leaving him with absolutely nothing. Night after night, in that cold, derelict bakery, bitterness and hunger gnawed at him. The text says he was in bitterness of soul. But desperation has a way of sharpening the mind. He wasn't just hungry for food anymore. He was hungry for a way up. He started to observe. He watched the city, the people, and he began to understand the rhythm of their lives and, more importantly, the rhythm of their deaths. He saw the elaborate funeral processions, heard the wails of the mourners, and noticed the deep, unshakable reverence they had for their dead. And in their greatest spiritual devotion, Rikayon saw his ultimate financial opportunity. He saw a pressure point no one had ever thought to press. He realized that while the king was a ghost, the one constant in Egypt was death. And death, he decided, was about to become very, very profitable. The birth of the death tax. Rikayon cooked up a scheme that was as simple as it was diabolical. He rose from the bakery ruins, no longer a victim, but a predator. He went into the city and, using his wits, hired a gang of 30 strong men of the rabble, armed them, and turned them into his own private enforcement squad. He didn't try to seize a palace or rob a treasury. He went for something far more valuable. He led his new mercenaries to the city's main burial ground, the sacred place where families laid their loved ones to rest. He seized it. He put his armed thugs at the entrance and gave them a simple, chilling order. His command, as the Book of Jasher records it, was this: "Thus said the king, strengthen yourselves and be valiant men, and let no man be buried here until 200 pieces of silver be given, and then he may be buried." Notice the genius in that lie. Thus said the king. Rikayon wasn't just a bandit. He was framing his extortion as a royal decree. In a kingdom where the king was invisible, who could possibly say otherwise? He was hijacking the king's authority to legitimize the unthinkable. The effect was immediate and devastating. Imagine the scene. A family arrives, carrying the carefully prepared body of their mother or father, ready to perform the sacred rites for their eternal peace. But at the graveyard gates, they're met by armed thugs demanding an exorbitant fee. 200 pieces of silver was a fortune, far beyond the reach of any average person. The city was thrown into chaos. The text describes bitter weeping as families were forced to leave their loved ones unburied, a horrific prospect for any Egyptian. The wails of mourning were no longer just for the departed, but for the living, who were being blackmailed with the very souls of their dead. Rikayon had found the one thing they would pay anything for, the peace of their ancestors. He had, in effect, put a toll booth on the road to the afterlife, and the money started pouring in. For 8 months, Rikayon and his men enforced this brutal tax, gathering great riches of silver and gold. He used this new wealth to expand his operation, hiring more men, buying horses, and turning his small gang into a formidable private army. He'd gone from a starving beggar to one of the wealthiest and most feared men in Egypt, all without ever meeting the king. But the cries of his victims were getting louder, and that one day of the year was fast approaching. A day of reckoning was coming, the showdown with the king. As the anniversary of the king's public appearance drew near, the anger of the Egyptian people reached a boiling point. They had endured 8 months of this monstrous tax, and the whole city was in ruin on account of this. This was their one shot to appeal to the highest authority in the land, King Osiris. When the day finally arrived, a massive crowd gathered before the palace. As King Osiris appeared, they cried out, "May the king live forever!" and then unleashed a torrent of complaints. They told him everything about Rikayon and his men, the armed guards at the sepulchre, and the crushing tax of 200 silver pieces for every burial. They laid their anguish bare, pleading, "We know it to be the custom of the kings to take a yearly tax from the living, but thou dost not only do this, but from the dead also thou exactest a tax day by day." They ended with a desperate cry, "Now, O king, we can no more bear this, and dost thou not know it?" King Osiris was furious.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
He'd been completely clueless about what was happening in his own capital. A rogue foreigner had been terrorizing his people and, worse, using his name to do it. He immediately summoned this impudent tax collector. But this was the moment Rikayon had been preparing for. He was no longer a desperate beggar. He was a master strategist. Long before the king's summons arrived, Rikayon had launched the second phase of his plan. He took a massive portion of the wealth he'd extorted and prepared a gift for the king. Not just a chest of gold, but a spectacle of unimaginable opulence. The Book of Jasher details the lavish tribute. A procession of 1,000 children dressed in fine silk, hundreds of horses saddled in glittering gold, and vast quantities of silver and precious gems. It was a display of wealth so staggering it would leave any monarch speechless. So, when the king's guards arrived to drag Rikayon to justice, they weren't met by a cowering criminal. They were met by the agents of an incredibly wealthy and seemingly loyal subject presenting an unprecedented gift. The tribute arrived before Rikayon did, softening the king's anger and replacing it with pure astonishment. By the time Rikayon finally stood before King Osiris, the atmosphere had completely changed. The king and his entire court were in awe. The king asked Rikayon to explain himself. And now, the man who had been ridiculed in the streets stood before the most powerful man in Egypt and, as the text says, spoke all his words wisely. We don't know his exact speech, but you can imagine the pitch. He likely framed his death tax not as extortion, but as an innovative revenue stream for the kingdom, all in service to the crown. He presented himself not as a thief, but as a brilliant administrator who had made the kingdom richer. His wisdom, combined with the sheer spectacle of his gift, completely won the king over. This has to be one of the most bizarre stories of political maneuvering in all of ancient history, and it comes from a text that sits on the very fringes of what we consider canon. If you're finding this story as incredible as I am, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel bring more of these hidden histories to light. And make sure you're subscribed, because the story of how this death tax created the most famous royal title in the world gets even stranger. Now, back to the king's stunning decision. The twist and the birth of Pharaoh. The people of Egypt expected justice. They expected Rikayon to be punished, maybe even executed. But King Osiris did something no one saw coming. He wasn't just impressed. He was captivated by Rikayon's sheer audacity and, more importantly, his results. He saw a man who, through pure cunning, had generated more wealth than the king's own treasurers. Looking at the foreigner who had outsmarted his entire kingdom, King Osiris didn't see a criminal. He saw the future. He stood before his court and made a declaration that would echo through eternity. He said to Rikayon, "Thy name shall no more be called Rikayon, but Pharaoh shall be thy name, since thou didst exact a tax from the dead." Let that sink in. According to the Book of Jasher, the origin of the word Pharaoh isn't a divine title. It's a nickname given to a man for his macabre yet brilliant tax scheme. The text claims Pharaoh essentially means he who collected a tax. And the king didn't stop there. He and his subjects, who now loved Rikayon exceedingly for his wisdom, made him the prefect or chief administrator of Egypt. Rikayon, now known as Pharaoh Rikayon, would govern the country day to day, while King Osiris continued his tradition of judging the people just once a year. In less than a year, the starving beggar had become the de facto ruler of the kingdom. The story concludes that the people of Egypt were so impressed by this new system that they decreed that every king who reigned after him would also be called Pharaoh. And so, according to this one text, a tradition was born. A title we associate with god kings and pyramids was, at its root, a testament to the world's strangest and most successful tax collector. Unpacking the legend, history, or hoax. Now, for any student of history, this story sets off 1,000 alarm bells. It's an incredible narrative, but is it true? This is where we have to step back and look at the source. The entire tale comes from the Book of Jasher, or Sefer HaYasher in Hebrew. This book is mentioned twice in the Bible's Old Testament, but the original text is considered lost. The version we have today, the one with Rikayon's story, is a Hebrew text published in Venice in 1625, but scholars believe it was likely composed much earlier, in the Middle Ages, perhaps around the 11th or 12th century. This means it's not a contemporary Egyptian record. There is no archaeological evidence, no hieroglyphic inscription, no papyrus that mentions a king Osiris, a foreign tax collector named Rikayon, or a tax on the dead like this. Egyptian records, especially about taxes, were extensive. Scribes meticulously recorded everything, but this specific death tax is nowhere to be found. Furthermore, the mainstream etymology of Pharaoh is completely different. Egyptologists trace the word to the Egyptian term PR, which means great house. Initially, this referred to the king's palace, much like we say, the White House announced. It only became a direct title for the ruler himself much later, during the New Kingdom. So, historically and archaeologically, the story appears to be folklore. But that doesn't make it worthless. Why would someone in the Middle Ages write this tale? One theory is that it's a form of cultural commentary, a folktale from a Jewish community to explain the famous biblical title Pharaoh in a way that fit their own narrative traditions. Another fascinating idea is that it's a distorted memory of the Hyksos. The Hyksos were foreigners from Western Asia who ruled parts of Egypt. Could the story of Rikayon, the man from Shinar, be a folk memory of this period of foreign domination? Some have even tried to link Rikayon to a specific Hyksos king named Rikayon, but this is highly speculative. A third possibility is that it's purely allegorical. It's a moral tale about how a corrupt system with an absent leader, Osiris, creates a vacuum that a cunning operator like Rikayon can exploit. So while you won't find Rikayon's name in a museum, his story is a powerful piece of historical fiction that gives us a window into how later cultures tried to make sense of Egypt's power. The true nature of Egyptian taxation. While Rikayon's death tax is likely a legend, the reality of taxation in ancient Egypt was just as central to the pharaoh's power, just a little less cartoonishly evil. The Egyptian state was one of the first truly effective tax bureaucracies in history. The pharaoh's ability to build pyramids and fund armies depended entirely on a relentless and highly organized system. The backbone of the economy was agriculture, so the primary tax was on harvests. Scribes would measure fields, estimate the crop yield, and farmers would owe a significant portion of their grain to the state. Tomb paintings even show tax defaulters getting beaten by officials. Another major form of taxation was the corvée labor system, basically a tax on a person's time. For a certain period each year, ordinary Egyptians could be drafted by the state to work on massive public projects like building temples or digging canals. Taxes were paid in kind, with grain, cattle, beer, or labor, since Egypt didn't use coinage widely until much later. Interestingly, the Egyptians' obsession with the afterlife did intersect with their fear of taxes. They actually worried they might have to perform corvée labor in the next life, too. But they came up with a clever loophole: small figurines called ashabtis. These were little statues inscribed with a spell, commanding them to do any work the deceased was called upon to perform in the afterlife. Wealthy Egyptians were buried with 365 of them, one for every day of the year. So, while there was no tax on the dead, they definitely had a system for tax evasion for the dead. So, who was the king who taxed the dead? The answer, it seems, is a ghost. A character from a medieval book, born from legend, not history. There was no Rikayon from Shinar who held the afterlife for ransom, and the title Pharaoh really means great house. And yet, the story of Rikayon endures for a reason. It's a story that speaks to a fundamental truth about power. It suggests that even the most divine authority might have its roots in something far more earthly and cunning. It takes the gilded, untouchable figure of the pharaoh and recasts him as the ultimate hustler, an outsider who saw an angle and played it better than anyone else. The legend might not be history, but it is culturally profound. It's a reminder that history isn't just written by the victors, but also by those in their shadow, trying to make sense of a power that seems absolute. It's a story that tells us to look behind the golden masks and towering monuments and ask where the power really comes from. And it leaves us with the tantalizing idea that sometimes the greatest legacies are born not from piety, but from profit. What do you think? Is the story of Rikayon just a fascinating piece of folklore? Or could there be a kernel of truth buried within the legend? Let me know your theories down in the comments. I'm always fascinated to read them. And if you enjoyed this journey into the bizarre side of ancient history, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into a historical mystery. Thanks for watching.